The morning of July 3rd, 1945, Major Hiroshi Kato sat in the dimly lit basement of the Imperial Army General Staff headquarters in Tokyo, staring at a single sheet of paper that made no sense. The document before him was a decoded American radio intercept, routine traffic between United States Pacific Command Centers. Buried in the transmission codes and unit designations was a personnel strength figure for the United States Marine Corps operating in the Western Pacific. The number claimed there were over 900,000 Marines currently deployed or in training for Pacific operations. Kato had spent 3 years in the 2nd Bureau's Intelligence Division analyzing American military capacity. According to every estimate his office had produced since 1942, the entire United States Marine Corps numbered perhaps 400,000 personnel at maximum strength, possibly 450,000 if the Americans had exceeded all reasonable mobilization projections, but 900,000 Marines in the Pacific theater alone, impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Kato checked his files. In December 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, 2nd Bureau, had estimated total United States Marine Corps strength at approximately 350,000 personnel worldwide. By July 1944, they had revised this upward to perhaps 400,000, accounting for America's apparently unlimited appetite for expanding its military. These were carefully calculated figures, developed by some of the most experienced intelligence analysts in the Japanese military. The estimates were based on detailed analysis of pre-war Marine Corps organization, American training infrastructure capacity, and logistics requirements for maintaining forces across the Pacific. And they were catastrophically wrong. The actual numbers would reveal a gulf so vast between Japanese assessment and American reality that it effectively illustrated why Japan had already lost the war, even as fighting continued with undiminished intensity across the Pacific. The intelligence failure went far deeper than simple mathematical error. It represented a fundamental inability to comprehend the scale of American industrial mobilization, the capacity of American training systems, and the determination of a nation that had fully committed itself to total war. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese naval aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States Marine Corps numbered exactly 54,359 personnel. This included officers, enlisted men, and support personnel serving everywhere from naval stations in the continental United States to embassy guards in China to small detachments scattered across Pacific Island outposts. The Marine Corps was a compact professional force. Standards were high. Training was rigorous. Most Marines were career military men who had enlisted during the Depression years when civilian employment was scarce and military service offered stability. The Marine Corps had spent the 1930s developing amphibious warfare doctrine, while the rest of America largely ignored the possibility of future conflict. Small unit exercises in the Caribbean, tactical development at Quantico, and theoretical studies at the Marine Corps schools had created a body of institutional knowledge about how to conduct opposed beach landings. But the Corps lacked the numbers to do anything with that knowledge on any meaningful scale. 54,000 Marines represented roughly enough manpower for 2 reinforced divisions, plus supporting aviation units and small detachments for traditional naval security duties. It was a force designed for limited interventions and expeditionary operations, not sustained theater-level combat against a major power. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, recruiting stations across America were overwhelmed with volunteers. Lines formed before dawn. Young men who had been working in factories, on farms, or trying to find any kind of steady employment in an economy still recovering from the Depression, suddenly had clear purpose. The recruiting surge was immediate and sustained. In the 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the Marine Corps had been processing approximately 2,000 recruits per month through boot camp. By January 1942, 20,000 recruits per month were arriving at the Corps' 2 recruit depots, Paris Island in South Carolina and the Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego in California. This created an immediate crisis in training capacity. Paris Island had facilities designed to handle perhaps 5,000 recruits in training at any given time. Suddenly, the depot was receiving 9,000 recruits in January 1942 alone. Temporary structures went up rapidly. Tent cities expanded across the marshlands. Drill instructors who had been training platoons of 40 recruits found themselves responsible for companies of 200. The training schedule was compressed from the peacetime standard of 8 to 10 weeks down to a rushed 7 weeks. Then, briefly, to just 4 weeks in early 1942, before Marine leadership recognized that 4 weeks produced inadequately trained Marines and extended the program back to 7 weeks minimum. But even with expanded facilities and accelerated training cycles, the existing infrastructure couldn't process the flood of volunteers. By March 1942, Marine Corps' strength had reached 143,388 personnel, nearly triple the size of the pre-war Corps, and the growth was just beginning. Congress had authorized Marine Corps expansion to a planned wartime strength of approximately 300,000 personnel. The authorization was based on strategic planning that assumed the Marine Corps would conduct amphibious operations in the Pacific, while the Army bore primary responsibility for ground combat in Europe and elsewhere. 300,000 Marines represented a reasonable, achievable target based on existing training facilities. With moderate expansion, it would allow for 6 Marine divisions, supporting air wings and necessary logistics and support units. The projection assumed the Marine Corps could expand its recruiting and training infrastructure at a measured pace over 18 to 24 months, gradually building capacity while maintaining quality standards. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American press reports and radio communications noted these authorization figures. 300,000 Marines fit comfortably with Japanese assumptions about American military capacity and cultural willingness to accept casualties in sustained combat. The problem was that 300,000 Marines represented what American military planners thought they might need in mid-1942, before the full scope of the Pacific War became clear, before Guadalcanal revealed that fighting for even small islands would require division-level forces and months of sustained operations, before Tarawa demonstrated that well-fortified positions might cost thousands of casualties to capture islands measuring just a few square miles, before commanders throughout the Pacific began requesting additional Marine divisions for operations that were not yet even on the planning boards. By July 1942, less than 8 months after Pearl Harbor, Marine Corps strength had reached 142,613. The Corps had nearly tripled in size, but it was nowhere near the eventual requirement. Camp Lejeune in North Carolina had been established on land that was swamp and pine forest in February 1941. By late 1942, it had become a massive training complex capable of housing and training an entire Marine division at a time. Camp Pendleton, near San Diego, opened in September 1942 on more than 125,000 acres of California ranch land. These were not modest expansions of existing facilities, but entirely new military cities built from nothing in less than 2 years. The training pipeline became an industrial process. Every week, new recruit classes formed at Paris Island and San Diego. 7 weeks later, they graduated and moved to advanced infantry training. Recruits who showed aptitude for specialized roles went to technical schools for training as radio operators, mechanics, artillery crewmen, and dozens of other military specialties. By 1943, the Marine Corps had established 21 separate occupational field categories, each containing numerous individual specialties, requiring formal schooling. Some Marines trained at Marine Corps facilities. Others attended Army, Navy, or even civilian technical schools under contract to teach military-specific skills. The scale of this undertaking would have been impressive in peacetime, with years to implement the expansion gradually. Accomplishing it during war while simultaneously fighting campaigns across the Pacific was a logistics and organizational achievement that Japanese intelligence planners fundamentally did not anticipate. Their estimates of American training capacity were based on peacetime norms and pre-war infrastructure. They knew about Paris Island and San Diego. They knew about Quantico. They had reasonably accurate information about the size and throughput capacity of these facilities as they existed in 1941. What they did not know, and apparently could not imagine, was that America would build entirely new training bases on a scale far larger than the pre-war facilities had been. That Camp Lejeune would eventually process and train tens of thousands of Marines. That temporary structures, tent cities and converted civilian buildings would add training capacity far beyond what formal base infrastructure suggested was possible. That Americans would compress training timelines, run multiple shifts, and find efficiencies that multiplied output without corresponding expansion of physical facilities. The concept simply did not fit Japanese military experience or cultural assumptions about how armed forces were organized and trained. By 1943, Marine Corps strength reached 308,523 personnel. The original congressional authorization for 300,000 had been exceeded, and the growth showed no signs of slowing. Intelligence reports from Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls consistently described encountering larger American forces than anticipated. After Tarawa in November 1943, where over 18,000 Marines from the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Betio Island, defended by approximately 4,500 Japanese troops, captured documents, and interrogated prisoners, provided detailed information about American unit organization and strength. The 2nd Marine Division, at full strength, numbered approximately 19,000 Marines. 3 such divisions represented 57,000 men, just for the division-level combat units, without counting aviation, logistics, training personnel, or Marines serving in non-combat roles. If America had 6 Marine divisions, which Japanese intelligence considered plausible, that alone would account for well over 100,000 Marines before adding any support structure. But the intercepts and prisoner interrogations suggested the Americans might have more than 6 divisions. How many more was unclear. Japanese intelligence analysts in Tokyo reviewed the evidence and adjusted their estimates upward. Perhaps the Americans had organized 8 Marine divisions, perhaps even 10, though that seemed unlikely. 10 divisions at 19,000 men each would be 190,000 combat Marines. Add aviation wings, logistics units, training commands, and garrison forces, and total Marine Corps strength might reach 350 to 400,000. This became the working estimate that shaped Japanese strategic planning through mid-1944. In reality, by 1944, actual Marine Corps strength stood at 475,604 personnel. The Corps had organized not 10, but 6 full Marine divisions, plus the 1st Marine Brigade, 2nd Marine Brigade, and various provisional brigades for specific operations. Marine aviation had expanded from a handful of squadrons to multiple aircraft wings with hundreds of aircraft. The entire structure was supported by vast training, logistics, and administrative organizations that had no pre-war equivalent. And still, the Corps continued to grow. The peak came in 1945, with 474,680 Marines in uniform, nearly 500,000 personnel in a service that had numbered under 60,000 just 4 years earlier. A 24-fold increase in manpower, accomplished while simultaneously fighting sustained campaigns across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean against a skilled, determined enemy who fought with suicidal determination to hold every position. For comparison, the Imperial Japanese Army, at its peak, numbered approximately 6 million men, but those 6 million were spread across China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and the Japanese home islands. Millions were tied down in garrison duties in occupied territories. Hundreds of thousands were committed to the campaign in China that had been consuming resources since 1937. The actual Japanese forces available to fight Marines in the Central Pacific represented a fraction of overall Japanese military manpower, and the Japanese Army struggled to sustain even those forces. Transportation across the Pacific became increasingly dangerous as American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. Reinforcements and supplies reached isolated island garrisons irregularly, if at all. Units that should have numbered 10,000 men often defended positions with 7,000 or fewer actual personnel, the difference made up by disease, inadequate rations, and inability to transport replacements through American-controlled waters. The Marine Corps, by contrast, had logistics backing the Japanese planners could not fully comprehend. Every Marine division in the Pacific was supported by a supply system that could deliver ammunition, food, medical supplies, and equipment with industrial efficiency. Ships carrying replacement personnel sailed on regular schedules. Casualties were evacuated to hospital ships and rear area medical facilities where survival rates far exceeded anything Japanese forces could achieve. When a Marine division needed reinforcements, they arrived within weeks. When Japanese garrisons requested reinforcements, they often received nothing but radio messages promising support that never materialized. Major Kato's confusion over the intercepted strength figures in July 1945 reflected the cumulative effect of 4 years of systematic underestimation. Japanese intelligence had started the war assuming American mobilization would follow patterns familiar to Japanese military experience. They assumed training capacity was limited by physical infrastructure. They assumed Americans would be unwilling to accept high casualties. They assumed the individualistic American culture would not support the collective sacrifice required for total war. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The training infrastructure that produced nearly 500,000 Marines operated on principles that Japanese military culture found difficult to accept. American training emphasized standardization and mass production of competent personnel rather than lengthy cultivation of individual excellence. A Marine recruit in 1943 spent 7 weeks at boot camp learning basic military skills, discipline, and rifle marksmanship. This was dramatically shorter than Japanese training programs, which emphasized months of intensive indoctrination and skill development. But the American system had advantages Japanese planners did not appreciate. A 7-week boot camp cycle meant new classes could begin every week, creating continuous output of trained Marines. Advanced infantry training added 4 to 6 weeks of combat-focused instruction. Specialized technical training varied by occupational field but rarely exceeded 12 weeks. Within 6 months, a civilian could be transformed into a technically competent Marine, ready for assignment to a combat unit. The system was not designed to produce individually superior warriors. It was designed to produce large numbers of adequately trained Marines who could learn additional skills through on-the-job training and combat experience. The philosophy accepted that some training would be incomplete, that some skills would be learned in theater rather than in training, and that units would continue training even while engaged in combat operations. This approach horrified Japanese military professionals who viewed proper military training as a years-long process of physical and mental conditioning. But in total war, the side that could field more competent fighters generally defeated the side that fielded fewer excellent fighters. Quality mattered, but quantity had its own quality. A Marine infantry squad in 1944 might not have the individual skills of a veteran Japanese squad that had been fighting together since China in the 1930s. But there were hundreds of American squads available where Japanese forces could field dozens. And the American squads had ammunition, air support, naval gunfire, reliable communications, and medical evacuation. The Japanese squads often had none of these things. Marine Corps training also benefited from institutional learning, impossible for isolated Japanese forces to replicate. After Guadalcanal, the lessons learned were incorporated into training programs at Camp Pendleton and Camp Lejeune. After Tarawa, the brutal close-quarters fighting that characterized assaults on fortified islands shaped combat training for divisions preparing for future operations. Flamethrower tactics, demolition techniques, and coordination with armor were refined continuously based on after-action reports from the Pacific. Japanese forces learned these same lessons in combat, but the knowledge often died with the defenders. Garrisons were isolated. Communication with Tokyo was sporadic. When an island was overrun, the tactical innovations its defenders had developed were lost. There were rarely survivors to debrief, rarely written reports that made it back to Japan, rarely opportunities to systematically analyze what had worked and what had failed in previous battles. By mid-1944, Japanese intelligence was receiving fragmented information, suggesting Marine Corps strength exceeded their estimates. Interrogated prisoners from various Marine divisions mentioned unit numbers and designations that did not fit the expected organization. Captured documents referenced training facilities and units that Japanese intelligence had no record of. Radio intercepts showed logistics coordination for forces far larger than 400,000 personnel should require. But the information was incomplete and contradictory. Without comprehensive intelligence gathering capability, Japanese analysts could not assemble the fragments into an accurate picture. They knew their estimates were low. They did not know how low, nor did they understand why the estimates were so far off. The analytical failure was not individual incompetence, but institutional blindness. The Second Bureau at the Army General Staff level entered the Pacific War with just 20 officers and 20 enlisted personnel focused on intelligence analysis of foreign militaries. 20 officers to analyze the military capabilities of every potential enemy the Japanese army might face. The Soviet Union had received primary focus in the years before Pearl Harbor. 2 or 3 officers addressed air intelligence. No one of significant seniority had been assigned to study American military mobilization in depth. The institutional assumption was that America's military capacity could be estimated from pre-war baseline data, adjusted for reasonable wartime expansion. The concept that America would transform its entire society and economy into a war production machine, operating at a scale beyond anything in military history, simply had no place in Japanese planning assumptions. Intelligence organizations reflect the priorities and cultural assumptions of the societies that create them. Japanese military culture in the 1940s valued offensive spirit, tactical excellence, and fighting determination. Intelligence work was often assigned to mediocre officers rather than the most capable because the best officers were assigned to operations and combat commands where advancement and glory could be earned. The intelligence service was understaffed, under-resourced, and culturally marginalized within the broader military hierarchy. Even when intelligence officers identified problems with estimates, they often lacked the institutional authority to force revisions. Operational commanders wanted intelligence that confirmed their operational plans were achievable. Intelligence that suggested the enemy was far stronger than anticipated was unwelcome. Officers who persistently delivered pessimistic assessments were seen as defeatist rather than realistic. This created organizational pressure to accept comfortable estimates rather than challenging, potentially demoralizing truths. The United States Marine Corps expansion from 19,000 to 475,000 personnel represented the largest proportional increase of any American military service during World War II. The Army grew from approximately 190,000 in 1939 to over 8 million by 1945, a 40-fold increase. But the Army started from a much larger baseline and had existing infrastructure that could be expanded. The Marine Corps essentially built itself from nothing, creating new bases, new training systems, and new organizational structures while simultaneously fighting a major theater war. Marine Corps recruit depots, Paris Island and San Diego, together trained over 400,000 recruits between 1941 and 1945. Paris Island alone processed 204,509 recruits during the war years. At the peak of operations in 1943, Paris Island had over 20,000 recruits in training simultaneously. The depot had expanded from 5 recruit training battalions in 1941 to 13 battalions by 1943. Every 7 weeks, thousands of new Marines graduated and moved to advanced training, replaced immediately by new recruit classes. The scale of this operation would have been visible to anyone with access to American military facilities. But Japanese intelligence had no such access. Reconnaissance aircraft could not reach American training bases deep in the continental interior. Spies and informants in the United States had been rounded up immediately after Pearl Harbor. Diplomatic channels were closed. The information available to Japanese intelligence consisted of radio intercepts, captured documents, interrogated prisoners, and open-source material like newspaper reports and magazine articles. American newspapers and magazines did occasionally publish information about military training, but the information was often vague, focused on human interest stories rather than comprehensive statistical data, and subject to censorship that removed specific details about force strength and capabilities. An article might describe Camp Lejeune as a major marine training facility without specifying that it could simultaneously train an entire division of 19,000 Marines, plus supporting units. A photograph might show Marines training with new equipment without revealing how many such units existed or were being formed. Japanese intelligence analysts, working with incomplete information, made estimates that seemed reasonable based on the data available to them. If they knew about Paris Island and San Diego, and they knew those facilities had certain capacity, they could estimate recruit throughput. If they assumed training took 12 to 16 weeks, which was standard for Japanese military training, they could calculate how many Marines could be produced per year. If they further assumed the Americans would maintain quality standards roughly comparable to Japanese standards, the estimates seemed logical. Every assumption was wrong. Training did not take 12 to 16 weeks. It took 7 to 8. Capacity was not limited to formal facilities. Temporary structures and tent cities multiplied throughput. Quality standards were different. Americans accepted adequate competence over individual excellence when adequacy could be mass-produced and excellence could not. The entire analytical framework was based on projecting Japanese military practice onto American operations, and the two systems operated on fundamentally different principles. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the time Major Kato encountered the intercepted strength figures showing over 900,000 Marines in mid-1945, the intelligence failure had compounded for nearly 4 years. But even confronted with evidence that contradicted established estimates, accepting the new numbers required believing that every previous assessment had been catastrophically wrong. It required accepting that Japanese intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial capacity, training systems, and national will. It required confronting the reality that Japan had been fighting a war against an enemy whose actual strength was perhaps 2.5 times larger than the best estimates suggested. Kato drafted a report questioning the reliability of the intercept. Signals intelligence was never entirely certain. Codes could be misread. Transmission errors could corrupt numbers. Unit designations might refer to administrative categories rather than actual combat personnel. The figure might represent all Marines worldwide, including support personnel, not just combat forces. There were numerous plausible explanations for why the intercepted number was so dramatically higher than Japanese estimates. All of them were more comfortable than accepting that the estimates were simply wrong. His report went to the Second Bureau Chief, who reviewed it briefly and filed it with other intelligence summaries. By July 1945, accurate intelligence about American strength no longer mattered for Japanese strategic planning. The war was manifestly lost. American bombers ranged freely over Japanese cities. The Soviet Union had entered the war, attacking Japanese forces in Manchuria with overwhelming strength. The home islands faced imminent invasion. Whether the Americans had 400,000 Marines or 900,000 Marines or 1,200,000 Marines was strategically irrelevant. Japan lacked the capacity to repel an invasion, regardless of the specific numbers involved. But the intelligence failure mattered historically because it illustrated a broader pattern that shaped the entire Pacific War. Japan entered the conflict with limited, accurate understanding of American capabilities and no framework for understanding American industrial mobilization. Throughout the war, Japanese forces consistently encountered American strength that exceeded estimates. On Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders thought they faced 2,000 Marines, when over 10,000 were present. At Tarawa, the estimate was off by a smaller margin, but still significant. By Saipan, in 1944, Japanese forces defending the island numbered 29,000 against an American assault force of over 70,000 Marines and Army troops. The pattern repeated across every major campaign. Japanese intelligence underestimated American strength, underestimated American firepower, underestimated American logistics capacity, and underestimated American willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. The underestimation was not random, but systematic, reflecting institutional limitations and cultural assumptions that prevented accurate analysis. The consequences of these intelligence failures extended beyond tactical surprises in individual battles. Strategic planning for the entire war was based on faulty premises about American capabilities. When Japanese military leaders planned for prolonged defensive warfare in the Pacific, they assumed they could inflict casualties at a rate that would exhaust American willingness to continue the war. The assumption was that Americans, being individualistic and soft compared to disciplined Japanese soldiers, would lose their resolve after sufficient losses. This assumption failed to account for American industrial capacity to replace losses and American national determination once fully committed to war. Every Japanese defensive success that inflicted heavy casualties on American forces was followed by American attacks that came back stronger. The 1st Marine Division lost heavily at Guadalcanal. It was rebuilt, re-equipped, and deployed to Peleliu. The 4th Marine Division suffered severe casualties at Saipan. It was reinforced and sent to Iwo Jima. Units that should have been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective by Japanese standards simply returned to action. The logistical system supporting this capacity for regeneration operated on a scale that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Every Marine wounded at Tarawa or Peleliu or Iwo Jima was evacuated to hospital ships offshore within hours. Medical care was excellent by the standards of the time. Survival rates for wounded Marines were far higher than survival rates for wounded Japanese soldiers. Even when injuries were comparable, Marines who would have died from wounds in Japanese service survived to return to duty. The replacement system ensured that Marine divisions could sustain operations indefinitely. When the 5th Marine Division needed replacements after Iwo Jima, they arrived from training depots in California. When the 3rd Marine Division rotated back to rest and refit after Guam, fresh Marines filled the depleted ranks. Japanese units defending Pacific Islands had no equivalent system. When a Japanese soldier was killed or wounded, he was often simply gone, his position filled by spreading remaining personnel thinner across defensive sectors or not filled at all. Japanese defensive doctrine called for fighting from fortified positions, maximizing American casualties while minimizing Japanese losses through skillful use of terrain and prepared defenses. The doctrine assumed that defending forces, properly dug in and supplied, could hold against much larger attacking forces by using superior tactical positions to offset numerical disadvantages. This assumption worked reasonably well in the early defensive battles like Tarawa, where 4,500 Japanese defenders inflicted over 3,300 American casualties before being overwhelmed. But the doctrine required that defenders remain adequately supplied, reinforced, and supported. By 1944, few Japanese garrisons met these requirements. American submarines had systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. The transport ships that should have been carrying supplies to isolated island garrisons were at the bottom of the Pacific. Japanese soldiers defending Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa fought with inadequate ammunition, food, and water. They could not be evacuated when wounded. They could not be reinforced when depleted. They fought until killed or forced to surrender with no prospect of relief or rescue. The Marines assaulting these positions, by contrast, had ammunition that seemed limitless by Japanese standards. Artillery batteries could fire thousands of shells in support of attacks. Naval gunfire brought battleship and cruiser firepower to bear on defensive positions. Aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. If initial attacks failed, Marines could withdraw, reorganize, and attack again with fresh troops and renewed fire support. Japanese defenders, once their initial ammunition loads were exhausted, had nothing but what they could scavenge from dead comrades or capture from Americans. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, defending Peleliu in September 1944, commanded approximately 10,500 Japanese soldiers in carefully prepared defensive positions. Intelligence suggested he faced a Marine assault force of perhaps 15,000. The actual force that landed on Peleliu numbered over 28,000 Marines from the 1st Marine Division, plus Army reinforcements that eventually brought total American strength to over 45,000 personnel. Nakagawa's defenders fought with extraordinary skill and determination. They held out for 73 days, far longer than most Pacific Island battles, but they were ultimately fighting with a numerical disadvantage of more than 4-1, and they received zero reinforcement or resupply, while Marines could continuously rotate units, replenish ammunition, and evacuate wounded. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, defending Iwo Jima in February 1945, commanded approximately 21,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors. He built perhaps the most elaborate defensive system of any Pacific island, with over 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions. Kuribayashi understood he could not win. His orders were to delay the American advance as long as possible and inflict maximum casualties. He estimated he faced a Marine assault force of 20 to 25,000. The actual American assault force consisted of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, totaling over 70,000 Marines, supported by Navy and Army personnel that brought total American strength to over 100,000. Despite brilliant defensive tactics that made every yard of Iwo Jima expensive to capture, Kuribayashi's forces were simply overwhelmed by the scale of American strength committed to the battle. Virtually every Japanese defender died, but they killed or wounded over 28,000 Americans, demonstrating that even correctly estimating enemy strength did not guarantee victory when the strategic situation was hopeless. The intelligence failures regarding Marine Corps strength were part of a broader pattern of underestimation that extended to American naval strength, air power, and industrial production. In December 1943, when Japanese Army intelligence estimated the U.S. Navy had approximately 300,000 personnel, the actual figure was nearly 2.4 million. The error was roughly 8-1. Japanese intelligence estimated American aircraft production at perhaps 10,000 planes annually. Actual production in 1944 alone exceeded 96,000 aircraft. These were not minor statistical errors, but fundamental miscalculations that shaped strategic planning. When Japanese leaders considered whether to continue defensive warfare or seek negotiated peace, their calculations included assessments of American capacity to sustain operations. If they believed American strength was limited and American will was fragile, continued resistance seemed rational. If they understood that American strength was effectively unlimited within the context of Pacific warfare, continued resistance was obviously futile. The intelligence failures encouraged continued resistance by masking the hopelessness of Japan's strategic position. Major General Seizo Arisue, who served as chief of the 2nd Bureau Intelligence Division at the Army General Staff in the latter part of the war, later testified that Japanese intelligence had systematically underestimated American military strength throughout the Pacific War. In post-war interrogations, he acknowledged that estimates of American naval personnel were off by factors of 7 or 8-1, that aircraft production estimates were wrong by similar margins, and that ground force strength estimates were consistently low. When asked why such large errors persisted, despite battlefield evidence that estimates were wrong, Arisue explained that the intelligence service lacked the personnel, resources, and institutional authority to force comprehensive reassessment of estimates that contradicted operational assumptions. The 2nd Bureau entered the war with 20 officers, analyzing all foreign military forces. Even at peak wartime expansion, the Bureau never exceeded perhaps 100 personnel focused on intelligence analysis. These officers were responsible for monitoring Soviet forces in Manchuria. Chinese forces throughout China and Southeast Asia, British forces in India and throughout the Pacific, American forces across two oceans, and various other allied militaries. They worked with incomplete information, outdated baseline data, and institutional pressure to produce intelligence that supported operational planning rather than challenged it. By comparison, the Allied intelligence effort in the Pacific included thousands of personnel conducting signals intelligence, photo reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, document analysis, and strategic assessment. The Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area, established in 1942, eventually employed over 1,700 intelligence specialists processing information from every available source. Individual Army and Navy intelligence organizations added thousands more personnel. The scale of Allied intelligence operations dwarfed Japanese capability by orders of magnitude. The intelligence disparity reflected deeper advantages in resources, technology, and institutional priorities. American forces could conduct extensive aerial reconnaissance over Japanese-held territory. Japanese forces could not photograph American training bases in California or North Carolina. American codebreakers had broken Japanese naval codes by mid-1942, providing strategic intelligence about Japanese plans and deployments. Japanese codebreakers achieved some success against Allied codes, but never at the strategic level that enabled broad understanding of Allied intentions. American intelligence officers could interrogate thousands of Japanese prisoners, process captured documents by the ton, and analyze Japanese equipment in detail. Japanese intelligence had access to relatively few American prisoners, limited captured material, and no systematic way to study American equipment and tactics. The cumulative effect was that American commanders generally understood Japanese capabilities reasonably well, while Japanese commanders consistently misjudged American strength. This asymmetry shaped tactical decisions, operational planning, and strategic calculations throughout the war. American operations were planned with realistic understanding of enemy strength. Japanese operations were planned based on estimates that routinely underestimated enemy capabilities by factors of 2 to 3 or more. On Okinawa in April through June 1945, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded the Japanese 32nd Army defending the island. His forces numbered approximately 77,000 combat troops plus thousands of Okinawan conscripts pressed into military service. Intelligence suggested he faced an American assault force of perhaps 100,000 to 120,000 troops. The actual American commitment to the Okinawa operation exceeded 550,000 personnel, including ground forces, naval personnel, and air support. The 10th Army alone, which conducted the ground assault, numbered over 180,000 combat troops, supported by massive logistics and naval forces. Ushijima fought a masterful defensive battle, using Okinawa's terrain to maximum advantage. He inflicted over 65,000 American casualties, including over 14,000 killed. The battle lasted 82 days, far longer than most Pacific operations. But the outcome was never in doubt. Japanese forces were outnumbered more than 2 to 1 in combat troops alone, outgunned by orders of magnitude in artillery and naval fire support, and completely dominated in the air. American aircraft flew thousands of sorties, supporting ground operations. Japanese air forces, reduced to kamikaze attacks, could barely contest American air superiority. Of the 77,000 Japanese combat troops on Okinawa, fewer than 7,000 were captured. The rest died. The extraordinarily low survival rate reflected partly Japanese military culture that made surrender almost unthinkable, but also physical reality. Japanese soldiers who had been on inadequate rations for months lacked the physical capacity to escape, even when escape might have been possible. Soldiers weighing 90 pounds from malnutrition could not run fast enough or far enough to evade American forces. They could not swim through rough ocean waters to reach other islands. They could not survive for days in the field without food or water. For practical purposes, fight to the death or surrender were the only options, and military culture eliminated surrender for most Japanese soldiers. The intelligence failure regarding American strength contributed to this catastrophic casualty rate. If Japanese strategic planning had correctly assessed that the Americans could commit over 500,000 personnel to the Okinawa operation, the battle might have been planned differently. Perhaps more forces would have been committed to defend Okinawa. Perhaps the defensive strategy would have emphasized different objectives. Perhaps Japanese leadership would have recognized earlier that continued resistance was strategically futile. But operating on underestimates of American strength encouraged tactical decisions that maximized Japanese casualties while having minimal effect on ultimate strategic outcomes. The Marine Corps' expansion from 19,000 to 475,000 personnel was one component of the broader American mobilization the Japanese intelligence failed to grasp. But it was a particularly significant component because Marines bore primary responsibility for the amphibious campaigns that drove across the Pacific toward Japan. Every major landing, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, involved Marine divisions as the primary assault force. Marine aviation provided close air support. Marine logistics sustained operations on captured islands while preparations continued for the next assault. If Japanese intelligence had correctly understood that the United States would field 6 full Marine divisions, plus supporting elements totaling nearly 500,000 personnel, strategic planning might have incorporated that reality. Defensive preparations might have been different. Resource allocation might have prioritized different objectives. The entire strategic calculus of trading space for time while inflicting maximum casualties on advancing American forces depended on assumptions about American casualty tolerance and replacement capacity. Those assumptions were built on intelligence estimates that were wrong by factors of 2 to 3. The institutional factors that caused the intelligence failure were deeply rooted in Japanese military culture and organizational structure. The Army and Navy maintained separate intelligence organizations that rarely shared information effectively. Intelligence gathered by naval units operating in the Central Pacific often never reached Army planners in Tokyo. Army intelligence focused primarily on ground operations in China and potential conflict with the Soviet Union in Manchuria. The Pacific Island campaigns were almost an afterthought to Army intelligence officers whose entire professional focus had been continental warfare against land powers. This fragmentation meant that even when accurate intelligence existed somewhere within the Japanese military system, it was not synthesized into comprehensive assessments that could inform high-level strategic decisions. A naval intelligence officer might correctly identify that American forces at Guadalcanal numbered over 20,000. But that information might never reach Army planners who were estimating total Marine Corps strength for strategic purposes. An interrogator might learn from a captured American that his unit was the 6th Marine Division, suggesting at least 6 divisions existed. But that single data point might not be correlated with other evidence to form a complete picture. The American intelligence system, by contrast, operated with extensive information sharing and centralized analysis. The Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Area, received intelligence from Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and allied sources. Analysts could cross-reference signals intelligence with prisoner interrogations, compare aerial reconnaissance with captured documents, and build comprehensive assessments from multiple independent sources. When estimates were revised, the new assessments were disseminated throughout the intelligence community and to operational commanders. The system was designed to create accurate understanding of enemy capabilities and ensure that understanding shaped operational planning. Japanese military culture also discouraged intelligence officers from delivering pessimistic assessments. An intelligence report suggesting the enemy was twice as strong as previously estimated was unwelcome. It implied that operational plans based on the old estimates were unrealistic. It suggested that previous intelligence work had been incompetent. It potentially damaged the credibility of commanders who had been planning operations based on the lower estimates. In a military culture that valued aggressive offensive spirit and viewed pessimism as defeatism, intelligence officers faced subtle but powerful pressure to produce estimates that supported operational plans rather than challenged them. This created a systematic bias toward underestimation. When fragmentary evidence suggested enemy strength might be higher than current estimates indicated, the tendency was to question the evidence rather than revise the estimates. Signals intercepts might be misread, prisoners might be exaggerating, documents might be deceptive. There were always plausible reasons to discount evidence that contradicted established assessments. And there were career incentives to avoid being the intelligence officer who persistently delivered bad news. The consequence was that intelligence estimates tended to be sticky, resistant to revision, even when battlefield evidence increasingly suggested they were wrong. The estimate of 300 to 400,000 total Marine Corps strength persisted through 1944, despite mounting evidence from multiple sources that the actual number was higher. Revising the estimate upward to 500,000 or more would have required acknowledging that previous estimates had been catastrophically wrong, that strategic planning based on those estimates was flawed, and that Japan's situation was even more hopeless than previously assessed. Major Kato's experience in July 1945, encountering evidence that total Marine strength might exceed 900,000 and questioning whether to believe it, illustrated the final stage of this institutional failure. By that point in the war, accurate intelligence was almost irrelevant. Japan had lost control of the seas, lost air superiority, lost most of its merchant marine, and was facing invasion of the home islands. Whether the Americans had 400,000 Marines or 1 million Marines mattered little when Japan lacked the capacity to defeat either force. But the inability to accept the evidence, the instinct to question the data, rather than revise long-held estimates, reflected institutional patterns that had persisted throughout the war. The actual peak strength of the United States Marine Corps in World War II was 475,000, 604 personnel in 1944, declining slightly to 474,680 in 1945 as the replacement rate stabilized and some personnel were discharged. The figure of 1.2 million Marines, suggested by the title, represents cumulative personnel who served in the Marine Corps during the war years rather than peak strength at any single moment. Between December 1941 and August 1945, approximately 600,000 Americans served in the Marine Corps at some point, including those who enlisted, served, and were discharged or killed before the war's end. Japanese intelligence estimates apparently never exceeded 400 to 450,000 for total Marine Corps strength and may have remained as low as 350,000 in some assessments as late as mid-1945. The exact estimates varied depending on which intelligence organization produced them and when, but all were significantly below actual American strength. The discrepancy between estimated strength of perhaps 400,000 and actual peak strength of 475,000 may seem modest compared to the more dramatic errors in estimating Navy personnel. But in context of how those Marines were employed, the underestimate had significant consequences. 400,000 Marines properly distributed might support 5 Marine divisions at full strength with adequate reserves, training pipeline, and support structure. 475,000 Marines actually supported 6 Marine divisions plus extensive aviation, logistics, and support elements with robust replacement systems that could sustain those divisions in continuous combat operations. The difference between 5 divisions and 6 divisions might determine whether the Americans could simultaneously conduct operations in the Marianas, the Philippines, and the Western Pacific, or whether they would have to sequence those operations with gaps between campaigns. Japanese defensive planning in 1944 and 1945 was based partly on assumptions about American operational tempo. If the Americans had limited forces, they could not simultaneously assault multiple objectives. They would need to capture one island, rest, and refit. then assault the next. This would give Japanese forces time to reinforce threatened positions, shift resources between defensive zones, and prepare for the next American attack. But if the Americans had enough forces to conduct multiple simultaneous operations, Japanese defenders could not concentrate their limited resources against single threats. They had to spread forces across multiple potential targets, weakening defenses everywhere. The intelligence underestimate contributed to Japanese assumptions that Americans would operate sequentially rather than simultaneously. In reality, by late 1944, American forces were conducting operations in the Philippines while simultaneously preparing for assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Marine divisions that had fought at Peleliu in September 1944 were resting and refitting while other Marine divisions prepared for Iwo Jima in February 1945. The operational tempo was relentless because the force structure could support it. Japanese planning did not fully account for this because the estimates of American strength did not suggest it was possible. The broader pattern of intelligence failure extended beyond simple numerical errors to fundamental misunderstanding of how American military forces were organized, trained, sustained, and employed. Japanese military culture emphasized quality over quantity, lengthy training over rapid throughput, and individual excellence over mass production of adequate competence. These values shaped how Japanese intelligence analysts interpreted evidence about American military expansion. When they saw evidence of rapid expansion, they assumed quality must be declining. When they saw compressed training cycles, they assumed American forces must be inadequately prepared. When they saw rapid replacement of casualties, they assumed American units must be combat ineffective. All of these assumptions were partly true, but strategically irrelevant. Individual American Marines in 1943 were probably less skilled than individual Japanese soldiers who had been training and fighting for years. But American Marines had advantages that more than compensated for individual skill gaps. They had overwhelming fire support from artillery, naval guns, and aircraft. They had reliable communications that allowed coordinated operations. They had logistics that ensured ammunition, food, and water were always available. They had medical evacuation that gave wounded Marines high survival rates. And they had numerical superiority that allowed them to attack defended positions with overwhelming force. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, might be individually more skilled in infantry tactics, but they fought with inadequate fire support, intermittent logistics, poor communications, minimal medical care, and numerical inferiority. The combination meant that even highly skilled Japanese units were systematically defeated by American forces that Japanese intelligence assessed as inferior in quality. The quality gap existed, but quantity and supporting capabilities overwhelmed it. This pattern repeated across every major engagement. Japanese intelligence would estimate American forces at perhaps 10 to 15,000. Actual American forces would number 25 to 30,000. Japanese defenders would fight skillfully from prepared positions. American forces would suppress defensive positions with massive fire support, assault with overwhelming numbers, and accept heavy casualties while steadily advancing. Japanese defenders would inflict higher casualties per capita than American forces, but would ultimately be annihilated, while American forces remained combat effective after absorbing losses. The strategic implications were profound. Japan entered the Pacific War assuming that fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. The assumption was not irrational, given Japanese experience fighting in China, where poorly equipped but determined Japanese forces had repeatedly defeated larger Chinese armies. But American forces in the Pacific were not poorly led Chinese provincial armies. They were well-equipped, well-supported, and increasingly experienced forces backed by industrial capacity that Japan could not match. As the war continued and evidence accumulated that American strength consistently exceeded estimates, Japanese strategic planning should have been revised to account for the new reality. Instead, the tendency was to explain away each tactical defeat as local failure rather than symptom of broader strategic problems. Guadalcanal was lost, because the Navy failed to provide adequate support. Tarawa was lost because the garrison was too small. Saipan was lost because American firepower was unexpectedly overwhelming. Each explanation was locally plausible, but collectively they indicated systemic underestimation of American capabilities. By 1945, Japanese military leadership privately recognized the war was lost. But publicly, the commitment to fight to the bitter end persisted. Part of this persistence reflected cultural factors and political constraints that made seeking peace difficult, but part reflected that as long as intelligence estimates suggested American forces were limited and American will was potentially fragile, continued resistance seemed to have some strategic logic. If Americans had 400,000 Marines and limited tolerance for casualties, perhaps defending the home islands would be so costly that the Americans would accept negotiated peace rather than invasion. If Japanese leadership had understood that Americans had nearly 500,000 Marines, millions of Army soldiers, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and essentially unlimited industrial capacity to replace losses, the hopelessness of continued resistance would have been undeniable. The intelligence failure, by masking the full extent of American strength, may have prolonged the war by sustaining illusions that resistance had some prospect of achieving favorable peace terms. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, finally ended the war. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. American occupation forces began arriving in late August. When American intelligence officers began interrogating captured Japanese military personnel about their wartime intelligence assessments, the scale of the estimation errors became clear. Japanese officers were genuinely shocked to learn the actual size of American forces they had been fighting. One interrogated officer stated that if someone had told him during the war that the United States Navy had over 3 million personnel, he would have considered it impossible propaganda. The concept that America had mobilized more than 12 million people into military service seemed beyond credibility. When shown documentary evidence of American production figures, training capacity, and force deployments, some Japanese officers initially refused to believe the numbers even after the war had ended. The scale of American mobilization simply did not fit their understanding of what was possible. The post-war interrogations revealed that intelligence officers had collected fragments of accurate information throughout the war. Individual reports correctly identified specific American units, accurately estimated strength of particular forces, and provided reliable tactical intelligence about American capabilities in specific engagements. But the intelligence system lacked the capacity to synthesize this fragmentary information into comprehensive strategic assessment. The pieces existed, but they were never assembled into a complete picture that could inform high-level planning. This failure was not unique to Japan. Intelligence failures have shaped the outcome of conflicts throughout military history. What made the Japanese failure particularly consequential was that it persisted throughout a 4-year war despite repeated tactical evidence that estimates were wrong. The institutional and cultural factors that caused the initial underestimation also prevented correction when battlefield experience revealed the errors. The intelligence system was designed to confirm existing assumptions rather than challenge them, and that design flaw had strategic consequences. The legacy of this intelligence failure extends beyond World War II. Modern military intelligence organizations study the Japanese experience as an example of how institutional culture, resource constraints, and cognitive biases can produce systematic analytical failures. The lessons include the importance of adequately resourcing intelligence functions, creating institutional incentives for accurate assessment rather than assessment that confirms operational preferences, and establishing mechanisms to revise estimates when evidence contradicts existing assessments. The United States Marine Corps that emerged from World War II was fundamentally different from the small professional force that had entered the war. The 19,000 Marines of December 1941 were mostly career military men who had enlisted during peacetime and spent years in service. The 475,000 Marines of 1944 included millions of citizen soldiers who had volunteered or been drafted after Pearl Harbor, trained for months rather than years, and deployed to combat with minimal peacetime service experience. This transformation from professional force to citizen military was not unique to the Marines. Every American service underwent similar transformation, but the Marine Corps experienced the most dramatic proportional change, expanding 25-fold while simultaneously fighting major campaigns across the Pacific. The organizational achievement of managing that expansion while maintaining combat effectiveness was remarkable and reflected institutional flexibility that Japanese military planners had not anticipated American forces could achieve. After the war ended, the Marine Corps demobilized rapidly. By summer 1946, strength had fallen to approximately 155,000. By 1948, it had stabilized at around 86,000, still larger than the pre-war force, but dramatically smaller than the wartime peak. The 6 wartime divisions were reduced to 2. Aviation wings were consolidated. Training infrastructure built during the war was mothballed or transferred to reserve units. The massive industrial-scale training system that had processed hundreds of thousands of recruits was dismantled. But the institutional knowledge and organizational structures developed during the war persisted. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the Marine Corps was able to rapidly expand again, drawing on the systems and procedures developed during World War II. The 1st Marine Division, which had fought at Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Okinawa, was reconstituted and deployed to Korea within months. The mobilization was not as dramatic as World War II, but it demonstrated that the capacity for rapid expansion developed during the Pacific War had become permanent institutional capability. The intelligence lessons from World War II also shaped post-war American military development. The recognition that comprehensive, well-resourced intelligence capability was essential for strategic success led to creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947 and massive expansion of military intelligence organizations. The United States never again wanted to fight a war with the kind of intelligence disadvantage Japan had experienced in the Pacific. The investment in satellites, signals intelligence, human intelligence, and analytical capacity during the Cold War reflected lessons learned about the strategic value of accurate understanding of adversary capabilities. For Japan, the intelligence failures of World War II contributed to post-war institutional reforms. The Japanese self-defense forces, established after American occupations ended, built intelligence capabilities that emphasized technical collection, comprehensive analysis, and institutional mechanisms to ensure intelligence-informed strategic planning. The cultural factors that had marginalized intelligence work in the imperial military were consciously addressed in the new organizational structure. Intelligence became a valued specialty staffed by capable officers rather than an afterthought assigned to mediocre personnel. The story of how Japanese intelligence underestimated American Marine Corps strength by factors of 2 to 3 is ultimately a story about the dangers of seeing only what you expect to see. Japanese intelligence officers were not stupid or incompetent. They worked with the information available to them and applied analytical frameworks that seemed reasonable. But their frameworks were based on assumptions about how military forces were organized, trained, and sustained that reflected Japanese experience rather than American reality. When evidence contradicted those assumptions, the tendency was to question the evidence rather than revise the assumptions. This cognitive bias, combined with institutional pressure to produce intelligence that supported operational planning and cultural factors that marginalized intelligence work, created systematic underestimation that persisted throughout the war. The consequences were tactical surprises, operational setbacks, and strategic planning based on fundamentally flawed premises about adversary capabilities. The intelligence failure did not cause Japan to lose the Pacific War. Japan's defeat was inevitable once American industrial mobilization reached full capacity and American forces achieved naval and air superiority across the Pacific. No amount of accurate intelligence could have overcome the fundamental mismatch in industrial capacity, resource availability, and national mobilization between the United States and Japan. But the intelligence failure may have prolonged the war by sustaining illusions that continued resistance had some prospect of achieving favorable outcomes. If Japanese leadership had understood in 1943 or 1944 that they faced American forces 2 to 3 times larger than estimates suggested, with industrial backing that could sustain those forces indefinitely and replace losses continuously, the strategic calculus might have been different. Perhaps peace would have been sought earlier. Perhaps the catastrophic final year of the war, with its massive casualties on both sides, might have been avoided. The intelligence failure did not change the ultimate outcome, but it may have changed the timeline and the human cost of reaching that outcome. The individual Marines who served during World War II were rarely aware of these strategic intelligence considerations. They knew they were fighting skilled, determined enemies who defended every position with suicidal determination. They knew they were part of a massive military organization that seemed to have unlimited resources and capacity. They did not know that enemy commanders consistently underestimated their strength, or that Japanese intelligence estimated Marine Corps forces at perhaps half their actual size. But the Marines benefited from that underestimation in concrete tactical ways. Japanese defensive planning based on faulty intelligence estimates sometimes distributed forces incorrectly, concentrating defenders where Americans were not attacking while leaving other sectors weakly defended. Japanese logistics planning based on underestimates of American strength sometimes failed to provide adequate ammunition or fortifications because planners assumed defenders would face smaller forces than actually assaulted. Japanese strategic decisions based on underestimates sometimes allowed Americans to achieve surprise by attacking objectives Japanese leadership considered too heavily defended for available American forces to assault. The cumulative effect of these tactical advantages was measured in American lives saved. When Japanese defenders were spread too thin because intelligence underestimated American force size, assault casualties were lower. When Japanese ammunition supplies were inadequate because planners underestimated the duration of American attacks, defensive fire was less intense. When Japanese reinforcements were sent to wrong locations because intelligence misassessed American objectives, assaults faced weaker opposition. None of these factors was decisive in any single battle, but collectively, they made every American operation slightly less costly than it would have been had Japanese intelligence been accurate. The Marine Corps casualties during the Pacific War totaled approximately 24,000 killed and 68,000 wounded. These numbers represented roughly 19% of peak Marine Corps strength becoming casualties at some point during the war. The casualty rate was high, reflecting the intense close-quarters combat that characterized amphibious assaults on defended islands. But it was sustainable because the training and replacement system could continuously provide fresh Marines to fill depleted units. Japanese casualties in the Pacific were proportionally far higher. Of the soldiers and sailors assigned to defend islands against American assault, survival rates were often below 10%. On some islands, virtually no defenders survived. The combination of American firepower superiority, numerical advantage, and Japanese tactical doctrine that emphasized fighting to the death rather than surrendering created casualty rates that would have destroyed any military force that could not be continuously reinforced. Japanese forces could not be reinforced, so they were systematically annihilated across every major defensive battle of the Pacific War. The intelligence failure contributed to these catastrophic Japanese casualty rates by encouraging defensive strategies that maximized defender losses while having minimal effect on ultimate outcomes. If Japanese intelligence had correctly assessed American strength, perhaps defensive doctrine would have emphasized different objectives. Perhaps more resources would have been devoted to making the cost of each island so high that Americans would seek negotiated peace rather than continuing offensive operations. Perhaps isolated garrisons would not have been ordered to fight to the last man when no prospect of relief or reinforcement existed. But operating on underestimates of American strength encouraged Japanese commanders to believe that inflicting heavy casualties on American forces in individual battles might cumulatively exhaust American will to continue the war. The assumption was that Americans, being individualistic and comfort-loving, would lose their resolve if casualties became too high. This assumption underestimated both American determination, once fully committed to war, and American capacity to absorb and replace casualties. The result was that Japanese forces fought to total destruction in defensive battles that delayed but did not prevent American advance. The story reaches its final chapter in the occupation of Japan, beginning in late August 1945. When the 1st Marine Division landed at Yokosuka Naval Base, south of Tokyo, on August 30th, Japanese civilians and military personnel alike were stunned by the scale of the American forces arriving. Ship after ship unloaded Marines, vehicles, supplies, and equipment. The columns of troops moving through Japanese streets seemed endless. For Japanese who had been told throughout the war that American forces were limited and American will was fragile, the visible reality of American military power was overwhelming. Some Japanese intelligence officers who had spent years analyzing American capabilities finally saw American forces in person. The equipment, organization, and sheer scale confirmed what battlefield reports had been suggesting for years. The Americans really did have the massive forces, the unlimited supplies, the industrial backing that Japanese intelligence had been underestimating. The evidence was no longer fragmentary signals, intercepts, or captured documents that could be questioned. It was thousands of Marines marching through Tokyo, supported by vehicles, weapons, and infrastructure that demonstrated American military capability in undeniable terms. For Marines who had fought across the Pacific, the occupation was a strange conclusion to years of brutal combat. Japanese civilians who had been portrayed as fanatical enemies, dedicated to fighting to the death, turned out to be ordinary people exhausted by war and relieved it was over. Japanese soldiers who had fought with suicidal determination in defense of every island surrendered quietly and cooperated with occupation forces. The transformation from total war to peaceful occupation happened with remarkable speed and minimal violence. The Marine Corps that occupied Japan in September 1945 was still near its peak wartime strength. Demobilization had not yet begun. The divisions that landed were fully equipped, fully staffed, and ready to fight if resistance materialized. But no resistance came. The Japanese government had ordered complete cooperation with occupation forces. Japanese military units that had fought to total annihilation on Pacific Islands surrendered en masse on the home islands without firing a shot. The contrast illustrated how different the war might have been if Japanese leadership had chosen to seek peace earlier rather than fighting to catastrophic defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.